Hi everyone, good to be here. I'm going to start off by saying I know there's many people in the room that have spent a lot of their career and a lot of time working on this topic and these species, so by no means is my goal today to cover everything there is to know about Lake Ontario coregonines, but I will try to provide kind of a multi-species perspective that we often don't focus on and highlight kind of some general streams of knowledge and information. So, coregonines fall under our deep pelagic and offshore benthic zone goal to protect and restore the diversity of the offshore benthic fish community. So in Lake Ontario we have 4 coregonines. Bloater, actually still considered extirpated but is being actively reintroduced. And then Cisco, lake whitefish, and round whitefish all have some degree of a self-sustaining population. So just some quick historical context. This graph highlights commercial harvest in thousands of pounds through time, just to give that long-term time scale. So this is Cisco's and chubs grouped together in red, lake whitefish in the light blue, and then Cisco or Coregonus ardei were specifically identified in the harvest starting in around the 50s, and that's the dark blue. So a few key things. We saw the major decline of bloater and Cisco's in the 1950s, largely attributed to overexploitation. At that point, the fishery really switched to targeting lake whitefish. They also had some gear improvements that increased fishing efficiency and effectiveness. So about 10 years later, there was a large decline in lake whitefish. So that the population remained relatively low and minimal through the 70s. However, there was a slight resurgence in the 80s and early 90s, mostly attributed to some fisheries regulations, some sea lamprey control, and other factors. Overall, it was pretty short-lived. We know Dracaena mussels invaded in the 90s. Subsequently, there was the loss of diapryas species, the main prey item of lake whitefish, and so the population has remained at lower levels since then. So overall, coregonines in Lake Ontario have experienced some major stressors and declines throughout the past century. So, as I said, I want to highlight kind of a multi-species perspective to start here. So this is showing you just presence-absence distribution of lake whitefish in red, Cisco in blue, and round whitefish in green. I hope that shows up okay. And this is all pre-2000, so I really tried to compile data from as many trawling and gill netting programs as I could, so thanks to the folks that helped with that. But overall, what we see is Cisco and lake whitefish are mostly distributed, or were mostly distributed in the eastern basin as well as along the south shore. Particularly if you look at the gill netting, round whitefish are more unique and were mostly caught along the north shore and around into the eastern or western basin as well. If we look more contemporarily, the trends are generally the same. If anything, Cisco and lake whitefish are maybe somewhat more distributed in the eastern basin and less along the south shore. Round whitefish, you can see 2 little dots in the gill netting graph there. So again, along the north shore, in the trawling graph, you can see that there's some detection down around Hamilton Harbor as well. You'll notice we don't have a lot of sampling along the north shore. There is some trawling up there, but there's kind of a handful of limitations about getting near in shallower areas with the trawls, and our gill netting has been limited. As Brian O'Malley mentioned, we'll be getting back out this August, so that will be helpful in some of those gaps. So in addition to spatial distribution, I wanted to highlight depth distribution. So I pulled together kind of the minimum and maximum depth in meters for the different species from gill netting and trawling programs kind of over the past 2 decades. So first looking at the whitefish, the benthic coregonines, round whitefish generally are captured in shallower areas compared to lake whitefish that average around 25 to 50 meters depending on the program. Cisco and bloater, the pelagic coregonines, also have differences in depth distribution, with bloater captured at deeper depths relative to Cisco. I'll highlight that, this information comes from mostly or solely benthic programs, so not necessarily the best at targeting pelagic species, but we do get a large number of captures, particularly, of cisco, so some useful information. The only depth overlap we kind of see is between lake whitefish and cisco, both kind of in that 20 to 30 meter range, but we know they differ in their benthic and pelagic behaviors. So even if there is some spatial and depth overlap, we would assume they're occupying different niches within the water column. So I think this just really highlights the diversity of the coregonines in Lake Ontario and how they're occupying really kind of unique niches. So now I will move into some species-specific kind of status highlights, starting with bloater. So bloater is a restoration species. It was one of 4 deepwater ciscos in Lake Ontario historically. Those populations crashed around the 1950s, and bloater was extirpated by 1984. It has been designated as a restoration species starting in 2012, partly to help restore a native fish community and aid for other species like lake trout. So some of the main restoration efforts around bloater has been reintroduction through stocking. So this graph just highlights stocked weight in kilograms through time by New York and Ontario, and you can see some of the stocking locations in the map on the right there. There's been a lot of research ongoing around stocking survival. So initial work by Natalie Clenard and others, and then more recently Lydia Pollock down in Oswego and collaborators looking at different stocking techniques and their effect on stocked bloater. So kind of what is the status of reintroduction at this point? This is a map from Brian Weidel and others, many others, paper from 2021. It's highlighting bloater stocking locations in blue, and then bottom trawling sites in the gray, and bloater recaptures in the red. And this is between 2013 and 2020. A total of 10 bloater, I believe, were captured starting in 2015. But you'll be getting, I think, some more updates in another talk with more recent data. This just highlights some additional data from acoustic detections. These were all fish released in the Eastern Basin, so you can see some kind of broad scale movements here. So overall, some signs of stocking survival, but more monitoring to come and some more updates, I think, later today. So now I'll move into round whitefish, and I'm really kind of considering this our limited knowledge coregonine. That's in part due to our more limited assessment along the North Shore, as you saw. At least in Ontario, a lot of our assessment programs are focused in the Eastern Basin. Although we do trawl near the North Shore, but like I said, it's farther offshore and not really targeting round whitefish habitat. There have been a handful of targeted round whitefish assessments in the past, but they've been more limited over the past couple decades. So what do we know? To reiterate, we know a little bit about spatial distribution. So this is just, again, presence, absence, pre and post, kind of the 2000 timeframe. So again, in the past, they were distributed kind of west of Prince Edward County across around to the Niagara River. Now we've detected them at 2 North Shore sites, as well as this circle there is just showing, if I were to add trawling into this, the only unique area that they're detected is down near Hamilton. So again, like I mentioned, our sampling of that area is limited, and we're hoping to get some more information this year. So in addition to general spatial distribution, we know a little bit about spawning. There were historical fall gill netting programs starting in the late 70s that did find evidence of spawning adults in those North Shore locations highlighted on the map in about 5 to 10 meters. We did go out in 2013 and 14 and set some fall gill nets again with the goal of collecting fish for genetic analysis. And the results from that showed that there were no genetically distinct spawning populations, at least up in that North Shore area. So then lastly, we have a kind of handful of information about relative abundance. This left graph is showing catch per gill net from the fall lake-wide program. No overall obvious trend from that assessment program. The other piece we can look at is a summer gill netting at 2 North Shore locations, Brighton and Coburg. Brighton we sample pretty periodically, and you can see some higher catches in the 90s, but then really we've lacked any catches kind of after the early 2000s. Coburg, we don't sample as consistently, but you can see some catches kind of around 2010, but we did not detect any round whitefish between 2012 and 2015. So overall, round whitefish do occupy a unique niche in terms of the coregonine species. Overall, there's some signs of maybe the population being more limited spatially and in terms of abundance, but again, our knowledge is somewhat limited in that area. So now I'll move into Cisco and lake whitefish. These are the species that we really have the most information on. We have extensive sampling in the Eastern Basin and along the South Shore where they are mostly located. I'll start off with Cisco. And here I'm just going to highlight adult abundance through time. So all of these figures are showing you catch per gill net through time across different locations. The left-hand side is Ontario waters, so the Bay of Quinte, Eastern Basin offshore, and Eastern Basin nearshore. And then the right hand is the New York waters of the Eastern Basin and the South Shore. So overall, after the 90s, abundance was pretty low. But then kind of starting around 2015, we've seen some evidence of increasing relative abundance across multiple sites. So with that, I was interested in looking at age structure. So we collect a lot of our age information through our commercial harvest sampling program. So there is a small commercial fishery for Cisco on Lake Ontario. It's really almost solely in the Bay of Quinte, which is quota zone 1-3 on the map here. And you can see harvest trends in pounds on the right. In general, harvest has been about 3,000 to 5,000 pounds per year over the past couple decades. So this program allows us to go out and sample, take length tallies and biological samples for age information from the commercial harvest. So what we've seen, particularly starting in 2017, this is showing you here the proportion of different ages in the harvest. And so there was a really high proportion of age 3 and 4 year olds, which correspond to the 2013 and 14 year classes. In 2019, we saw those same year classes recruit as 5 and 6 year olds. And then if we jump ahead 3 years, we saw those 2 year classes again as 8 and 9 year olds. And overall, in the past 2 years, you can see that we've seen a broader range of ages present. So some signs of more successful recruitment. You can see this fluctuating pattern. I know Taylor Brown and others are actively working on year class strength estimate models, and we'll be digging into some of the factors that are driving year class strength. So I think more insights to come on that. So we can also look at recruitment at early life stages. So this graph highlights the catch per trawl of young of year age 0 Cisco through time. You can see in the late 90s and early 2000s, recruitment appeared minimal, and catches started to increase in the early 2000s and really picked up after around 2010. In addition to age 0s, there's other early life history work going on. So again, Taylor Brown and others published this paper in 2021, and this is work around larval coregonine emergence. So this graph is particularly for Cisco. The gray kind of circles show where sampling occurred, and then the dots are where they detected larval Cisco. So you can see distribution was mostly in the Eastern Basin, the Bay of Quinte and Chameau Bay, some detections in other areas. And overall, 94% of the captures were Cisco. So Overall for Cisco, there's some signs of increasing adult abundance and more successful recruitment in recent years. Okay, so last but not least is lake whitefish. Lake whitefish specifically have a fish community objective around increasing abundance and reestablishing spawning populations outside the Eastern Basin. So a bit of background context. In Lake Ontario, lake whitefish have had two kind of major spawning aggregations that have persisted through time. So one I'll call the bay spawning group that spawns in the upper Bay of Quinte, and the other the lake spawning group that spawns off the south shore of Prince Edward County. This is just in Ontario waters. There's work going on in Chameau Bay and other areas, but these have kind of been the two large spawning groups that have persisted through time. So I'll highlight that there has been a bit of genetic work done back in 2009 to assess if there's genetic differences between these two groups. At that point, there was no significant genetic differentiation. However, we know that there's been large population declines, a lot of stress for this population, so it's possible that genetic markers might be masked at this point. And so whether there's potential for future genetic differentiation would depend on a number of factors, but could be something to keep in mind. So I'll start with a general adult abundance. So again, this is graphs of catch per gill net through time at a number of different sites. I'll start by focusing on the right-hand side, Ontario waters, because New York trend is a little bit different. But overall, we see a decline in the 90s, and abundance has remained relatively low since then. So just to highlight a few kind of key events or key factors here. Many of you are familiar in the 90s when Dracaenid mussels arrived. There was a loss of Diaperia species from most of Lake Ontario, which was the main prey item of lake whitefish. So as a result, the population, there was a number of observations within the population. So the first was that they were observed dispersing farther and deeper in new areas, and one of those areas was New York waters. So that could explain the graph on the right where there was actually a kind of increasing trend in the late 90s. So in addition, there was some evidence of die-offs in the late 90s. Jim Hoyle and others documented rapid decline in body condition. So this graph is small, I know, but I'm really just highlighting, this is showing you relative weight, so a measure of body condition for the bay and lake spawning groups. But you can see a sharp decline around 1993 by about 16%. So in addition to that, growth rate decreased and age at maturity increased. So really the lake whitefish population experienced a large amount of stress during this period. And so with this change in prey availability, what have we seen in terms of their diet? Originally in the early 2000s, there were some papers that documented whitefish mostly eating Dracaenid mussels. We have some more recent information. So this was provided by Emma Bloomfield with Dr. Tim Johnson's group. And so what you're looking at is proportion by volume of different prey items within lake whitefish diets across 3 seasons. So in the spring, really high proportion of chironomids in the diet, so midges, which are readily available at that time of year. In the summer, that switches to predominantly round goby. And so we had some kind of informal evidence that that was happening, but it's pretty apparent here that that's a large component of the diet, particularly in the summer. In the fall, diet appeared more diverse with consumption of predatory cladocerans, particularly spiny water flea, as well as amphipods, some Dracaenid mussels and gastropods as well. So in the fall, they're spawning, likely just feeding on what's readily available, maybe not as particular. The last thing I'll highlight is over on the right, you can see a chart of the percentage of empty stomachs. So in the spring, only 2% of fish had empty stomachs, so relatively low, and then that increases through the summer and into the fall. So I know I have here that this is the lake group only, which is true for the fall. These fish were collected from the commercial harvest. And so we are pretty confident in the fall with those locations that they would be lake fish. In the spring and summer, there might be some spatial overlap based on where these samples came from. So right now we don't have a comparison of diet between the groups, but I think there might be some evidence that there could be differences. So I'll kind of go through a bit of that. So first, this is a growth curve, so fork length at age for the lake group in orange and the bay group in blue between 2014 and 2023. So this is data from our commercial harvest sampling, which is why you don't see some of those younger age classes shown here. But really what you see in this graph is that the lake group kind of has a higher length at age relative to the bay group in earlier years. Around about 16 years old, we see that switch where the bay fish exceed length at age relative to the lake fish. So overall, the lake group is appearing to have kind of a more rapid growth rate in early life and more of an obvious switch to investment in reproduction, whereas the bay fish are showing a bit more of a slow and steady growth strategy. So there could be a number of factors influencing that, like diet, also energy expenditure. So we have some information that could provide insights into that. This is work from actually my master's thesis at Queen's University with Dr. Bruce Tufts, where we used acoustic telemetry to assess lake whitefish movements. So there's a lot going on in these graphs, but really the one on the left is highlighting the spatial distribution of the bay group on the left and the lake group on the right across 4 seasons. Really the takeaway is that we found the two groups used pretty different areas throughout most of the year, with the bay group mainly occupying the Bay of Quinte and Ontario waters of the Eastern Basin, whereas the lake group occupied more so areas outside the Eastern Basin into New York waters around Henderson there, and also potentially on the west shore of Prince Edward County. So the spatial overlap that we did observe is shown on the figure on the left. And so when did we detect fish at the same time and in the same location? That was limited to these locations in Ontario waters of the Eastern Basin, and it was really predominantly in August. So we hypothesized that as lake fish were kind of moving back towards their spawning grounds and the bay fish were still in that area, that there was some higher overlap during that period. So the other thing I wanted to highlight is the potential for different kind of spatial range or migrations between the groups. So these are plots for single fish. The top is showing you a fish from the bay group that was kind of an outlier movement. It was the only fish to go over and use New York waters of the Eastern Basin, and it did that in 2 subsequent years. Compared to the lake group, which was a fish down in the bottom panel here that traveled all the way to the mouth of the Niagara River, hung out there for a couple months, and then moved back into the Eastern Basin. So some initial evidence that the lake group might have the capacity for larger migrations and be using a broader spatial range. But I think overall, this telemetry data highlights some potential for differences related to space use, like things like prey availability, energy expenditure, thermal conditions, that could affect the conservation or productivity of these groups. So the last thing I'll highlight and compare here is recruitment. So this is catch per trawl of young of year, age 0 whitefish. The blue is showing our Eastern Basin trawl site, and the black, the Bay of Quinte, so each representing the relative spawning groups. Not shown here is older data. Again, year class strength estimate information from Taylor Brown's group and others shows that year class strength was high in the late 70s through the 80s and into the 90s. But as you can see here, that really catches seem to decline in the late 90s. We had a couple of strong year classes, but overall catches have been pretty minimal. Our bottom trawling probably doesn't have high enough resolution to be detecting small scale changes. So there is other work going on again, the larval coregonine emergence by Taylor Brown and others. Now I'm showing here lake whitefish. So again, larval detections were mostly restricted to the eastern basin. But what really stood out was that only 6% of captures were lake whitefish relative to Cisco. So overall for lake whitefish, relative abundance and recruitment appear low relative to the past, but stable overall at this point. So to try to wrap all that up, we have quite a lot of information for Cisco and lake whitefish, although there's a lot more to learn. And in combination with bloater, there's been a lot of focus and effort towards increasing our knowledge. Round whitefish, on the other hand, we know that they're occupying a unique niche in the coregonine family, and some potential signs that the population is reduced in terms of abundance and distribution. But again, our knowledge is pretty limited. Overall, the coregonines, I think, have shown their diversity and resiliency, and I think there's a lot more work to be done, but I hope this kind of provided a unique multi-species overview, and I'm glad we had some time to chat about it today. Thanks.